Nobody tells you that loving someone too hard can hollow you out from the inside. And the moment I heard his voice through that half open door, I understood that the life I had been so desperately trying to save was never actually mine to begin with. My name is Zuri Adeze Calloway Minth, and I was 39 years old the spring I stopped disappearing. Before that spring, I had been disappearing for 6 years. 6 years of waking at 4 in the morning to the hiss of the oxygen concentrator we kept in the corner of our bedroom, a machine that breathed for Theodric when his lungs forgot how. 6 years of crushing 14 pills into a fine white powder because he couldn't swallow capsules whole anymore, stirring them into applesauce the color of old honey, carrying the bowl to the adjustable bed we'd rented from a medical supply company in Savannah, Georgia, setting it on his tray beside the television remote and the crossword books he never finished. 6 years of changing sheets that smelled like betadine and night sweat. 6 years of calling insurance companies, disputing denials, faxing documents to case managers named Brenda and Kyle, who worked in cubicles in states I'd never visited and who held Theodric's survival in their hands between lunch breaks. 6 years of erasing myself so thoroughly that when I passed the mirror in the hallway, the long oval one in the antique frame I'd bought at an estate sale in Macon before everything changed, I sometimes stopped and looked genuinely surprised. Not by how I looked, by the fact that I was still there at all. Theodric Renshaw Minth had been my husband for 11 years when the diagnosis came. We met at a spoken word night at a bar in Atlanta called Copper and Vine, a narrow room with exposed brick and fairy lights wound around exposed pipes, where a woman named Celestelle was reading a poem about her grandmother's hands, and the whole room was holding its breath. I wasn't holding my breath. I was trying to get the bartender's attention to order a ginger beer when Theodric leaned over from the stool beside me and said, without preamble, "She reminds me of August." And I said, "Of August specifically?" And he said, "August always smells like something ending." And I decided in that exact moment that I was going to marry this man someday. We were married 2 years later in a botanical garden in Decatur, under jasmine, with my grandmother Olivia crying into an embroidered handkerchief. Theodric wore deep plum. I wore ivory Dupioni silk made by a seamstress named Briseis on Memorial Drive. For 5 years we were fine, not in the muted, defensive way that word is often used, but fine the way a room feels when the light is exactly right and you're afraid to move. Theodric taught high school English and coached the debate team, and I ran a ceramic studio in Kirkwood, making bowls and vases that sold at boutiques and a farmer's market. We were building something. You could feel the weight of it. Then the tremors started. They were small at first, a coffee cup shaking in his hand, a signature on a check that looked unfamiliar, wobbly at the edges. He thought he was tired. We both thought he was tired. He was teaching 5 classes, coaching the debate team, writing a novel on weekends, a mystery novel set in 1940s New Orleans that he'd been working on since before I knew him. We said, "Rest." We said, "Slow down." He slowed down. The tremors didn't. The diagnosis was primary progressive multiple sclerosis, delivered by a neurologist named Dr. Vanderloop in a beige office in Midtown Atlanta, a box of tissues already on the desk between us, which I remember thinking was ominous before I understood exactly why. There is no treatment that reverses it. There is only slowing. There is only watching the body renegotiate its relationship with movement, with the nerve signals that carry information the way rivers carry water, and watching as those rivers begin, one by one, to silt up and run dry. Within 18 months, Theodric needed a cane. Within 3 years, a wheelchair. By the time he was 44 and I was 37, he was largely bedridden, his world reduced to that adjustable hospital bed in what had been our guest room, which we'd converted because the bedroom was upstairs and the stairs had become impossible, and to the portable tablet I'd mounted on a swing arm so he could read, and to the television, and to me. I closed the ceramic studio. I tried for a while to work reduced hours, but the logistics were labyrinthine, and the emotional cost of leaving him, spending even 3 hours thinking about glazes while he lay in that bed, was more than I could consistently sustain. So I stopped. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I would return when things stabilized, when the new medication showed whether it was helping. I told myself everything you tell yourself when you are dismantling your life piece by piece and need to believe there is a reassembly waiting on the other side. The studio became a storage unit, and eventually I sold the inventory at prices that made me feel sick, donated the equipment, and the studio became a memory I kept in a sealed compartment and tried not to open, because the grief inside it was the complicated kind. Not clean or loud, but layered and shapeless. Within 18 months of the diagnosis, Theodric needed a cane. Within 3 years, a wheelchair. By the time he was 44, he was largely bedridden, his world reduced to an adjustable hospital bed in what had been our guest room, a tablet on a swing arm, the television, and me. I became, in the vocabulary social workers used, a full-time caregiver. What that means concretely: I woke before dawn, morning care, turning him to prevent pressure ulcers, cleaning him, handling catheter care, changing sheets. Medications crushed into powder and stirred into applesauce. Physical therapy exercises 3 times a week from a printed protocol because insurance had cut the visits. Calls, paperwork, special diet meals. I also managed finances on a budget that had shrunk dramatically, learned basic plumbing and electrical work because we couldn't afford to call someone every time something broke. I also tried to maintain a household. I managed finances on a budget that had shrunk dramatically. Disability payments were not designed for a life. I learned plumbing basics, electrical basics, because we couldn't afford to call someone every time something broke. Poverty sharpens you in some places and numbs you in others. I had no time that was mine. I want to be exact about this because people often imagine caregiver exhaustion as a fatigue cured by a vacation. What it actually is, at its deepest, is a disappearance of self so gradual you don't notice the individual erasures. You only notice, one day, that the person you used to be has been replaced by a function. I was not Zuri anymore. I was the woman who managed Theodric's care. My thoughts were organized around his needs. My emotions were organized around his emotional state, because he was depressed. How could he not be? And managing his depression required a constant performance of steadiness I maintained even when I was not steady, because my visible distress made his worse. I want to be fair to Theodric here. He was grateful in the early years. He cried sometimes, thanking me. He told me I was saving his life. And I believed for a long time that love was precisely this: showing up completely, giving the whole of yourself to another person's survival. I had been raised to believe it. My grandmother, Olivia, had nursed my grandfather through his final illness for 3 years, and the family spoke of it with a reverence that had shaped my understanding of devotion so early that when my own time came, I stepped into it almost without question. This is what serious love looks like, I thought. This is what you do. What I didn't know, or refused to know, was what was happening in the years when gratitude curdled into entitlement. When the man who had wept thanking me began to assume my presence, my labor, my dissolution as his due. The first sign I saw was a small one. It was a Tuesday in late October, 2 years before everything fell apart. I'd driven to the pharmacy, a 20-minute errand, and when I came back, his friends Quinlan and Deshante were over, as they sometimes were on Tuesdays. I heard laughter before I got through the door. I walked in, called out I was home. The laughter continued. I put away the medications, went to say hello. Theodric barely glanced at the door. I went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink with my hands flat on the counter. Something about the casual completeness of that scene, the ease, the laughter, my invisibility, sat in my chest like a stone. I explained it away. He deserves to feel normal, I told myself. He doesn't need to make a production of greeting me every time I walk through my own front door. I said that to myself, and I believed it because the alternative, sitting with what I'd actually felt, which was erased, was something I couldn't afford. The second sign was larger. At a holiday gathering at his brother Prescott's house, which I had helped coordinate entirely, buying and wrapping gifts, preparing dishes, driving us there, transferring him to the wheelchair, navigating a house that wasn't accessible without a word of complaint, I overheard his mother Marcine tell his aunt that Theodric was handling everything so well. I was standing 4 feet away, visible, casserole dish in hand, handling everything. I said nothing. I had a skill for saying nothing. I had honed it over years into something almost elegant. But these were signs I'd chosen not to read. And some part of me, the part trained to equate self-sacrifice with love, to confuse endurance with virtue, had been actively refusing them. Because reading them meant asking a question I wasn't ready to ask. What is this actually? And what is it costing me? And what would happen if I stopped? I didn't ask that question until the Thursday in March, 6 years and 2 months into Theodric's illness, when I overheard him talking to Quinlan and Deshante on speakerphone. I want to tell you exactly how it happened because the details matter. Not the way details in movies matter. Not dramatically, not with music swelling underneath, but the way real revelations happen, which is quietly, on an ordinary afternoon, in the middle of a task so mundane it barely registers. I had been doing laundry. I had carried a basket of folded clothes down the hall to the linen closet that was adjacent to the room where Theodric slept, and his door was not fully closed. It was ajar by about 4 inches, which was enough to hear the speakerphone clearly. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was standing in my own hallway with a stack of towels in my arms, and the door happened to be open, and his voice happened to be raised in that particular way it got when he was performing for an audience. Looser, louder, a register I recognized as his social self, the self he'd been before the illness narrowed his world. Quinlan was asking him something about Marcine's upcoming birthday dinner. Were they going to go? Theodric said, "Zuri'll figure it out. She always does," and laughed. Something about the way he said it, the lightness, the certainty, the total absence of any awareness that this arrangement had a cost to it, that the woman who always figured it out was a person with a person's needs, made me hold very still. Then Deshante said, "Man, you lucky she's still there. My sister said she would have been gone after year 2. And Theodric said, "I will carry this for the rest of my life," the exact sound of his voice, how casual it was, how comfortable. Where's she gonna go? This is her life now. She gave up everything else. I'm what she has left. I'm what she has left. I stood in the hallway with the folded towels and I felt, in a way I had no language for at the time, the floor of something give way. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a crumbling, just a quiet giving way, like the moment you step onto ice and feel it flex beneath you before you've fallen. That instant of pure knowledge before the consequences arrive. I put the towels on the shelf. I closed the linen closet door with care. I walked to the kitchen. I filled a glass of water and drank it slowly. My hands were not shaking. Something in me had gone very quiet and very clear, the way a sky goes right after a storm has moved through, when the pressure has changed and everything looks oddly lit. I'm what she has left. He hadn't said it with cruelty. He'd said it with certainty, which was worse. The certainty of a man who had so thoroughly internalized his position at the center of my existence that he'd stopped thinking of it as a position. It was simply geography. Zuri is here because she has nowhere else to be. The 6 years of labor and sacrifice and self-erasure hadn't registered as choices I was making. I had become a fixture, a function, a given. And the clarifying, terrible thing I understood, standing in my kitchen with the water glass, was that he wasn't entirely wrong. I had, over 6 years of incremental surrenders, built a life so narrow that I had left myself almost nothing outside of it. The studio, the friendships I'd let atrophy. My cousin Tendai, who had stopped calling after I'd canceled 4 times. My friend Odalis, now in Portland, whose occasional texts I answered in the window between midnight medications and sleep. My mornings, my evenings, my attention, all organized around another person's needs so completely that I had become, as Theodric had correctly identified, a person with nowhere to go. Except there is a thing that happens sometimes when you have been very close to the bottom of something, when you have been so eroded that there is almost nothing left, and the thing that happens is not despair. Despair is for people who still have enough of themselves left to be afraid of losing more. What happens at the actual bottom is a very specific clarity. The clarity of a person who has been stripped of most of her pretenses and is standing almost raw in what remains. What remained in me was this: I was still here. 39 years old, with hands that knew how to make things, with a mind that had spent 6 years solving problems most people would have collapsed under, with a resilience tested into bedrock. I had not disappeared entirely, though I had come very close. There was still a Zuri underneath the caregiver. She had been very quiet, but she was there, and she was done. Not done with Theodric. Life is not a movie, and people with severe disabilities do not simply become obstacles to overcome. What I was done with was the version of my life his certainty had described. The version in which I was here because I had nowhere else to be, in which my presence was not a choice, but a default. I made a call that evening to my cousin Tendai. She picked up and I said her name and she said mine back and neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me." And I said, "I think I've been gone for a while." And she said, "I know, I've been waiting." Not as reproach, as fact. The fact of someone who had kept a door open even when I stopped coming through it. That call was the first thing I had done in 6 years that was entirely for me. Over the following weeks, I contacted the county social services office about respite care, a program I had known existed for years but never pursued, because accessing it felt like an admission I wasn't ready to make. A social worker named Florentina helped us access 16 hours a week of paid care. 16 hours that were, for the first time in 6 years, mine. I used the first 4 to drive to a ceramics studio in Decatur that offered open sessions. I paid the floor fee, sat at a wheel, and put my hands in clay. The clay was too wet. I overworked it. The first 2 pieces collapsed. I didn't care. By the end of the session, I had one bowl, small, uneven, the lip thick on one side, and I held it in both hands when I was done and felt something come back into me that I hadn't known, until that moment, how profoundly I'd missed. I drove home, and when I came through the door, Theodric was watching television, and the woman who had been staying with him, a home health aide named Mrs. Delory, 62 years old, efficient and warm, who had worked with dozens of families in situations like ours, said everything had gone fine. And Theodric said, "How was your errand?" He called it an errand. I said, "It wasn't an errand. I went to make ceramics." He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him in years, faintly uncertain, slightly recalibrated, and said, "Oh." And I said, "Yes." That yes was the beginning of a renegotiation that was, by turns, painful and awkward and necessary and hard and ultimately transformative. I am not going to tell you that Theodric became a different person. He didn't. He remained in many ways the man who had told his friends with casual certainty that I had nowhere to go. But people are more complex than their worst moments, and what I found, as I slowly, carefully, began to reclaim space in my own life, was that the dynamic between us, which had calcified into something that hurt us both, honestly, because a person treated as a fixture stops being a person to himself as much as to anyone else, began haltingly to shift. I went back to the studio. I joined a collective of ceramic artists working out of a shared space in East Atlanta. I started selling again, slowly, at a weekend market and then online. I took on 3 private students for wheel throwing lessons on Saturday mornings. I started sleeping later on the mornings Mrs. Delory came. Not a lot. I still rose early. The body doesn't unlearn 6 years quickly, but enough to remember what it felt like to have a morning that began on my own terms. I told Theodric what I had heard through the door. Not immediately. I held it for several weeks, turning it over, understanding my own part in it. The way I had never, not once in 6 years, told him clearly that I was struggling. I had performed steadiness so consistently that I had inadvertently taught him there was nothing to worry about. My suffering had been invisible not only to him, but in a meaningful sense, to me. When I told him, we were sitting together in late afternoon light, him in his bed, me in the chair I'd pulled close, and I said it plainly, without crying, which surprised me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know I thought of it that way." I believed him. That was the most complicated part, believing him. Not because it absolved him, but because careless certainty in a person who has been served and centered for years is not always deliberate. It is often just the shape of what they've been allowed to become. We had both participated in that shaping. What he said next, "I don't want to be what you have left. I want to be what you choose. I will carry differently from the first thing." That was what made the renegotiation worth attempting. We are still together. Choosing yourself does not always mean leaving. Sometimes it means staying while becoming, finally, yourself, while demanding that your presence be recognized as a choice and not a default, while building, in the margins of a difficult life, something irreducibly yours. I am making ceramics again. I have a small online shop and a booth at the East Atlanta Village Farmers Market on the first Saturday of each month. Last fall, I was in a group show at a gallery on Edgewood Avenue. My piece was a tall, narrow vessel the color of ash with a cracked glaze that showed the red clay underneath. I called it Reentry. Tendai and I talk every week. Odalis came from Portland, and we stayed up until 2 in the morning, eating plantains and talking about everything we'd missed. Mrs. Delory comes 4 mornings a week. I am still Theodric's primary caregiver. I always will be. But I am no longer only that. I am not what he has left. I am what I chose to become, even after the longest detour of my life. The bowl I made on that first day back, small, uneven, the lip thick on one side, sits on my studio shelf. I have not sold it. I never will. It is the most honest thing I have ever made. If this story cracked something open in you, like it did for me living it, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next.